Welcome to Second Sunday for October 23. I'm Paul Lover, a volunteer with the Friends of Great Swamp. Our Second Sunday programs are made possible by the Friends of Great Swamp and by the generous support of the Marta Heflin Foundation. Today's speaker, Marilyn Kitchell, is a wildlife biologist and an expert on bats and bat conservation. Marilyn is currently working in public affairs for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Office of Communications. Formerly, Marilyn served as a biologist and visitor services manager right here at Great Swamp. In addition, Marilyn earned her master's degree studying Indiana bats here on the Refuge. More recently, Marilyn has spent 2 years leading communications for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services White Nose Syndrome program. This program heads up the international response to this devastating disease that impacts hibernating bats. We are excited that Marilyn is with us today to share her expertise and insights on bats. So please join me. Let's welcome biologist, researcher, and science communicator, Marilyn Kitchell.
Make me sound like I've done a lot. So I'm going to skip through this a little bit about me part because Paul shared a lovely introduction, so you don't need to hear that part anymore. But I could talk about bats all day long. So I figured today, instead of talking about Great Swamp bats specifically, or just talking about white nose, which is the disease that is really affecting them, I would just sort of take a step back and talk broadly about bats globally, and we can narrow in on the different things that they do. And if you have specific questions, we can, I think we said we're going to hold them till the end. I'm going to get my phone out just so I can track time while we chat. But we'll talk broadly about bats, their ecology, their echolocation, how they do that, what they do. We'll talk about bat conservation, and we can talk a little bit about artificial bat habitat, because I know people really like to support bats and their needs. So we'll talk about that too. Just to start, like I said, very broadly, bats are the only mammal to have evolved flight. They belong to the mammalian order Chiroptera, which means, does anybody know what that means? It'll make sense to you when I say this. It means hand wing. And that's because of the bones of their wing are very similar to the fingers of the mammalian hand. Does anybody know what they are most closely related to? We want to wager a guess. Mice is very frequently the answer that I hear to that. They are actually most closely related to primates. And so they likely evolved from tree climbing mammals that later evolved wings and then learned how to echolocate. And so this specimen is a 52.5 million year old bat specimen. It has the longer rear legs of a tree climber. Its forearms are shorter than the forearms of modern bats, and it actually has a claw on each of its 5 digits. So all of these are really helpful if you are a tree climber. Modern bats only have a claw on their thumb on the first digit. So they're actually far more related closely to primates than to mice. They are not flying rodents, and they are not part of the order Rodentia. There are 1,400 species of bats worldwide, and that number is always sort of ticking upwards as we learn more about our natural world. They are broadly distributed across every single habitat on Earth, with the exception of the most extreme deserts and the polar regions. And they are distributed across urban habitats and rural habitats. Bats are so adaptable that they can literally live anywhere, and they don't decipher between wild urban spaces and wild natural spaces. This map shows you the species diversity of bats. So the red and the orange spots are the biodiverse hotspots, where you have more species in any one particular place. So the blue shows you everywhere where bats exist. And if you do not see a blue color, those are the very few regions on Earth where bats do not exist. The old world fruit bats that we know as the flying foxes, the ones with the 6-foot wingspans, they live in Indonesia and the old world, sort of that string of islands north of Australia. That's where the flying foxes come from. And you can see that Central and South America are really truly a global hotspot for bat diversity. In the United States, we have the most concurrent species in the American Southwest, where we have 27 species in any given place. And here in New Jersey, we have 9 species of bats. So, what do bats eat? Can anyone wager a guess?
Fruit.
Fruit, yep, that's an accurate answer. What else? Mosquitoes, yep. So mosquitoes belong to which group? Insects, correct? So many bat species are insect eaters. Anything else? See if we can blow your mind here a little bit. Where did my food? There we go. So 70% of bats are insect eaters. They are insectivorous bats. That's represented in the blue section of this pie chart. So the vast majority of bats consume insects, and they are it is so energetically demanding to sustain yourself in flight that they can consume, easily half of their body weight in insects in a single night. And so if you extrapolate that out over a population of bats, you're talking millions and millions of insects being consumed off the landscape in a given night. And for that reason, bats are critically important as pest control agents. So they are really helpful to our farmers, and they help control a lot of forest pests as well. They love eating moths and beetles and butterflies, which are not usually out too much in the evening hours, which is why moths are a big part of their diet. They will eat mosquitoes, but they are not primarily focused on mosquitoes. If you think about sort of the heft of a mosquito compared to the heft of a moth, there's far more to be gained by eating a moth than to eat a tiny little mosquito. So they're opportunistic, they will eat them, but their preference is to bigger bodied insects. About 18% of our bat species do eat fruit. And so these are the things like the old world. There are also nectivorous bats. So these are the bats that pollinate a lot of things. And we have bats to thank for tequila because they pollinate the cactus that produces the agave that we produce for our tequila. So we have nectivorous bats. There are also meat-eating bats that will catch and eat rodents and fish and small birds. And they're typically in Central America and South America. Really wild and fascinating to watch the videos of bats capturing mice on the rainforest floor. And bats swooping over a stream and catching fish with their feet and scooping them up into their tail membranes. Really amazing stuff. There are also 3 species of vampire bats that are sanguinivorous, and so they do consume blood. And what they do is far less creepy than we like to blow up in all of the popular media. A blood meal for them is about a tablespoon, and their preferred food sources are like cattle or horses, and some species actually narrow in on chickens and birds. And they have an anticoagulant in their blood that prevents the blood from clotting, which has been explored for treating stroke victims. Because if you can use that, they actually named the drug Draculin because it's derived from the blood of vampire bats. But what it does is it helps prevent the clot that is causing stroke. And so if you can treat patients with that drug within 9 hours of stroke symptoms, you can increase by like 80% their ability to rebound from stroke. So really amazing things in those vampire bats. They've also been shown to be very altruistic. They will actually adopt orphaned young, and they will share blood meals among the colony. If they find that other bats have not eaten in a long time, they will actually share meals. So really complex social interactions in those vampire bats. But there are only 3 species, and they're all in Central and South America. So echolocation. Does anyone want to try and give like a quick summary of what that is and what that means?
Sort of like sonar.
Right. Correct. So for our online audience, said it's sort of like sonar, that they bounce sound off of things because they can't see very well. The idea that they can't see very well is actually a little bit of a misnomer. They have perfectly fine vision and they can see very well at night. But like most of us who have vision, we rely primarily on vision because they have echolocation at night. They rely primarily on echolocation and they sort of use vision as a secondary, but they actually can see just fine. So echolocation is this process of emitting really, really high pitched sounds from the vocal cords. Those sounds travel through the environment. They encounter whatever physical objects are in the environment, and then they bounce back to the bat's very sophisticated, ear structure. At which point the bat interprets the shape of the sound that comes back to them to decipher what physical thing it is that they've encountered in the environment. And this is how they find their meals. So here's a question for you. Do all bats echolocate? No. Which bats don't echolocate? Fruit bats, right. So if you're eating fruit that's hanging from a tree and not moving around in your environment, first of all, you don't need to be so strictly nocturnal in your behavior because that fruit is out all day long. And so in the fruit bats, you actually see that their eyes are much bigger relative to the size of the eyes on the echolocating bats because they're using them a lot more. And they are active not strictly at night because they don't need to be for their food sources. And so they may use some very rudimentary, what they call wing clicks, or some very rudimentary vocalizations to communicate with each other. But it's only the hunting bats, right? The insectivorous bats or the carnivorous bats or the sanguinivorous bats that are using echolocation to make sense of their environment. Let's see if I can click on this link if my computer screen will actively take me to it. Great. So this, I just wanted to give you a sense of the incredible diversity that we see in the shape of bats' faces and in their ears. So they have evolved to have very different facial structures and ear morphology based on niche separation. So how they separate out the environment and go after different kinds of prey and what they eat and where they are. And some of them are particularly endearing and some of them are a little bit less endearing. But all of that incredibly specialized morphology is based entirely on what other bats are in their environment that they're competing with for food and habitat and what they're eating. So I just wanted to share that. Let's see if I can get back to my other screen here. Good, we're in good shape. So echolocation, as you can imagine, all of those specializations in the structure of the facial features in the ears also results in differences in the shape of their call. So what you're looking at here is a graph of the echolocation calls of various species of bats. And so on the y-axis going up and down, you have the frequency of the call, which is kind of like in human terms, whether you're a high soprano or whether you're a low baritone. And then over the bottom, the x-axis, we have call duration. So how long that call goes out. So some species have very drawn out calls and some species have very short calls. And if you overlay those together, you can see that there are some parts of some species calls that stand out and do not overlap with any other species. So where that happens, you can actually use the call without ever having captured the bat to determine what kind of a bat you have. And as bats are becoming more and more rare on our landscape and it becomes more and more difficult to capture them in a net, biologists are relying more and more on echolocation and the calls to determine what bats are in the environment and how many we may have. But you can also see there's a lot of overlap. So if a particular bat's call is in the portion of its vocabulary that overlaps with several other species, it will be hard to use that call to determine which one it is. So you get this phenomenon where, yes, we can use the calls to determine bats. However, 60% of the calls that get recorded are kind of not helpful. And so you record an awful lot of calls with the hopes that you're going to get a very few that are really clear to help you figure out what bats are there. And you just have to understand that the rest of it you're kind of going to have to throw away and not be able to make much sense of. So this is what an individual bat call looks like when you record it and graph it against the software packages that are available. Again, on the y-axis, you have the frequency, and on the x-axis, you have that time scale. And they sort of show the same effect approaching and leaving the zone of, the auditory zone of the microphone, same way that a car would as it's going down the road. So as it approaches the microphone, it gets louder, you capture more of the call. As it flies away from the microphone, you get less. We also have attenuation in the environment where you'll lose some of the call that doesn't get picked up, but where you get very clear, right in front of the microphone portions of that recorded call, you can actually see harmonics. And so in the center of this graph where you see that duplicate, second call, that's actually the harmonic, which is the high portion of the frequency, the way same as you would hear in an orchestra or in a choir of everybody singing in tune with each other. You'll get that call reverberating and you'll actually hear like an octave above the main call. So very, very cool, but rarely captured. Only in the best of calls will you see that. So an example of what this looks like, this is the hoary bat. This is the biggest bat that we have in New Jersey. They are a very large bodied bat, head to tail. They're, can be 6 inches. And they are open canopy flyers. So they fly out over the tops of the trees and searching for their prey. So they emit on that y-axis, and that particular frequency will carry a good long distance, which is useful if you're an open canopy flyer, but it returns very little information about what you encountered. So this call works really great for the hoary bat because they can be flying out over the trees and they can be like, oh, there's an insect way over there, sweet, and go closer and get it. But that's not going to be very useful if you are flying around inside a forest where you're returning very little information about the stuff that you're encountering. It can either be a twig, or it could be a seed pod, or it could be an insect. So if you are a forest flyer, you have very high frequency calls. So rather than being low, rather than being the baritone of the bat choir, you're a high soprano. So your call returns a lot more information about the object that it encounters, but it may break down faster in the environment. So you can only pick up maybe what's close to you, but you're going to know the difference between an insect and a leaf stem. And so this is an example of what you'll see in the northern long-eared bat, which is another species that we have here at the swamp. So these are some examples of calls that I recorded in my work as a biologist at Lenape National Wildlife Refuge. So this is a little brown bat that was recorded at Cherry Valley National Wildlife Refuge. You can see they have a slight S shape to their call. And they are one of the myotas, so they have these high frequency calls that are pretty straight up and down. They're forest flyers, and they like to see, they'll follow the streams and the corridors through the woods, the trails, get their insects there. This is a tricolored bat. They have a really consistent sort of hockey stick shaped call that is just the same every single time. There's no bouncing around in that call. So they're very easy to identify, very dissimilar from the other bats that we have. This is a red bat, which is now one of the most common bats that we have. They also have that hockey stick shape, but they tend to bounce around a little bit. They'll like sort of bounce up to and then down to and up to and down to. So that sort of meandering pattern to their call is also very distinctive. And then this is the big brown bat, which is also one of the most common bats that we have anymore. They're a little more consistent, a little lower frequency. They also tend to overlap with a bunch of other species. So they can be a little confusing in their calls, but when you get a good one, it's pretty clear that that's your only option. So if you are in New Jersey, there are 2 ways to get through the winter. Your options are either to hibernate or to migrate. And so New Jersey's bats break up into those 2 groupings. The migratory tree bats will move south for the winter. You can see from the outstretched wings of the red bat that I have in that top picture on the right, they are more heavily furred. Their wings have fur, their tail membranes are covered in fur, and that helps to provide them with the warmth that they need to get through the winter when they're not truly hibernating. The hibernating bats are the ones that are most susceptible to white nose syndrome. We'll talk about that in a bit, but they're the ones that retreat into a hibernacula that has a really specifically consistent temperature and humidity through the course of the entire winter. So they will shut down their heart rate when a bat is active, may be 200 beats per minute. When they're hibernating, their heart may be 2 times per minute. So their respiration rate, their temperature drops so that their body temperature is the same temperature as their ambient environment. All of that is designed to reduce the body's need for fat and energy. So they stockpile as much as they can eat. They really fatten up going into hibernation, and then they shut down to get through the winter using as little energy as they can possibly get by using until those insects are back in the landscape in spring, and then they'll come back out and become active. So of the hibernating bats, we have here on the top left, the little brown bat. To the right of that, we have the big brown bat. One row down to the left is the northern long-eared bat, which is federally endangered. That one is listed specifically because of the impacts of white nose syndrome. To its right is the Indiana bat. That one has been listed since 1967, due largely to disturbance in hibernacula sites. To the bottom left, we have the tricolored bat, which is proposed as endangered. Its numbers have also been hammered by white nose syndrome. That is the reason for its decline. To the right of that, we have the small-footed bat. They like to roost in talus slopes and mountain regions, so like rocky crevices is where they hang out, which is pretty cool. On the top right, we have the red bat, which I have personally always felt looks like Eddie Munster. Below it on the left, we have the silver-haired bat, which is smaller than the hoary bat, but also a very large-bodied bat. And in the bottom right corner, we have that hoary bat, which is our biggest. Its body length is, maybe 6 inches. Its wingspan, could be 11 or 12. Very impressive bat when you have it in the hand. And they have this beautiful sort of tricolored fur. You can see that silvery and that tawny color. Again, very heavily furred because they're a migratory tree bat and they need that to keep them warm through the winter months. So some of the challenges that we have in bat conservation. Our bats have typically not been helped by popular culture. There are very few movies and memes out there that talk about how cuddly and adorable that they are. So we have a lot of people who sort of have that initial ick factor with bats. It certainly does not help bats' case that they are a rabies vector species, and rabies is a disease that should not be messed with and should not be taken lightly because rabies has a very high mortality rate in people if we get it. So you really don't want to be approaching or handling bats. And those of us who work with bats have to be vaccinated against rabies. It's a 3-series shot, and you have to check your titer every few years to make sure that your immunity levels are still where they need to be, and you may need to get periodic booster shots. And so only people who have been vaccinated and trained to work with bats should ever be handling bats. So there's our popular culture piece. Because bats are very scattered on the landscape in summer months, it can be really hard to try and enact bat conservation in the summer. So bat conservation was historically limited to their winter habitats, where bats congregate in numbers or in certain places and can be easier to count in the winter months. That was historically how we focused on bat conservation, was protecting their winter habitat, where we knew they were dependent on these few sites where they gathered in large numbers. Wind energy growth now poses a significant risk to bats. So bats who migrate for the winter will rely very heavily on these mountain ranges, and these, like, the same places that are well suited for wind are well suited for bat migration and hawk migration. And so the development of wind poses a strong threat to our migratory tree bats. And there's a ton of research going on in this front to figure out how we can mitigate mortality at wind turbines to bats. For some reason, they seem to be attracted to the turbines. So where you do pre-construction surveys and you don't find a lot of bat activity and you decide, okay, this might be a good spot for a bat for a wind turbine because we're not finding a lot of bat activity. Then you build the wind turbines and then you have more bat activity than you had before. So it's not really clear why they are attracted to the turbines. And there's a lot of research on that front to try and figure out what's going on and can they be deterred from these turbines to mitigate that mortality. But certainly, you know, as we deal with climate change and try to figure out ways to improve the future for lots of species conservation, wind is a part of that. And as with many things, there's no silver bullet answer. So there are challenges that come with that too. And this is a several years old graph, but just shows you sort of the trajectory of what the development of the wind industry in the United States and elsewhere, and what that may do for our concerns about bat conservation. Because of the confluence of white nose syndrome and wind industry buildouts and changing weather patterns, there are a new State of the Bats report came out this spring that sort of looks at all bat species in North America and finds that 52% of our North American bat species are at risk of severe decline in the next 15 years. So bats, broadly speaking, in North America are looking at a rough future and need our help. The biggest threat to New Jersey's bats at the moment, as you may guess, is white nose syndrome. And so I would not recommend that you try and read everything that's on this graph. I will talk you through it, but the infographic at left is actually out of date. White nose syndrome is now confirmed in 40 states and 8 Canadian provinces. The fungus that causes white nose syndrome has been detected in several more states. So Alaska and Hawaii so far seem to be in the clear, but pretty much everywhere else in North America at least has likely detected the presence of the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, or is probably likely to detect it in the near future. White nose syndrome is the disease that kills the bats, but it is caused by a cold-loving fungus. And so that picture on the right that's sort of UV lit is a picture of a bat wing, and those white hot spots that you see are detection of the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. So we have learned in the many years since white nose syndrome first appeared in 2006 that it's caused by a cold-loving fungus that thrives at the precise temperature and humidity range that North American bats depend on for hibernation. And we have learned that this fungus appears to have come from Europe, where it's been detected on bat specimens that have been pulled from museum collections dating back to at least 1905. So how long it was present in European bat populations, we still don't really know, but European bats don't seem to show the same mortality as North American bats. What we do know is when that fungus arrived here, likely in the early 2000s, it didn't take very long before it started decimating our novel bats who had never been exposed to it before and had never had to deal with this fungus before. And so what it does is it grows into the exposed skin. Once it gets into that temperature and humidity range in those hibernacle environments where bats are in the wintertime, and the bats come into that habitat in winter, their immune system shuts down, their body activity shuts down, and the fungus ramps up. So the bat essentially becomes a substrate that's just perfect for this fungus to grow on. And the bats are not active either to groom it off or to keep their body temperature above the appropriate temperature of the fungus. And it grows into the skin membranes. It's called white nose syndrome because it shows up on the muzzle and on the ears. So that's how it was first seen. That's what was first made clear to the researchers that were monitoring their wintering bats, is this really odd fungus that was growing around the muzzle. But it can disrupt their water balance. So the skin is very important in helping bats maintain their moisture regimen in the winter months. It's normal for bats to wake up 6 or 7 or 8 times over the course of a winter to get a drink and rehydrate. But when you have the fungus growing through the skin, it really causes them to dehydrate far more rapidly on the wall. And so early biologists were finding bats basically shriveled and dried up and dehydrated. They're not just dying from, well, there's 2 things that happen. There's the dehydration issue, because of the fungus growing into the skin, but also we think, based on witnessing bat behavior, that it's causing a fair amount of irritation. So they are waking more often, both to get a drink because they're more thirsty, but also we think to try and preen themselves of the irritation of the fungus. So they're waking more often through the course of the winter. They're burning through those fat reserves. Every time they wake, it uses a lot of body fat to bring their body up to temperature so that they are physically capable of flight. So they're running out of their fat stores before the insects are back on the landscape in the spring. So in the Northeast, where this was first witnessed in 2007 is when biologists first noticed it, but going back through pictures of previous winter hibernacular surveys, they then found that the first photographic evidence of this on a bat was in the winter of 2006 in a cave outside of Albany, New York. So since 2006, it has spread across 40 US states and 8 Canadian provinces. It does not affect all bat species equally. The bats that migrate for the winter are largely not susceptible because they're not going into hibernation in those cave environments and mine environments where the fungus thrives. So they may pick up the fungus, but they're not showing disease. Of the bats that hibernate, not all bats are equally impacted. So they all have slightly different physiology, just like all of us has slightly different physiology. And some bat species are actually fairly resilient. They're not heavily impacted on it. They do have bats that die from it, but not to the extent that it's hammering their populations. Other species, we've seen nearly 100% mortality in some of these species. And so 90 to 100% mortality rate in many hibernacula, you're talking about sites that have gone from 30, 40, 50,000 bats to maybe 80 over the span of several years. My personal history with white nose is pretty strong. You heard in the introduction, I got my master's studying Indiana bats here in the days where little brown bats were our most common. Northern long-eared bats were our second most common species, and Indiana bats, which was the federally endangered bat that I was here to study, was our third most common species at the swamp. I used to catch great numbers of tricolor bats too. I did my master's work in 2006 and 2007, and then a little bit rolled over into 2008. 2007 was when white nose fungus was first detected in Albany. And then 2009, 10, 11, our bats started to decline because of white nose syndrome. And I was actually in the mine survey in Hibernia the winter that we detected white nose syndrome on our bats that first time in New Jersey. And I was finding my banded bats on the floor of the cave, which was pretty heart-wrenching. And then I went on to work with the white nose syndrome response team many years later. So it has continued to spread. It continues to be a challenge, but we do have some developments that give us reason for hope. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So what does bat conservation look like amid white nose syndrome? There has been an incredible amount of research and management support for bat conservation, not just in the areas where white nose syndrome has already become established and impacted our populations, but ahead of the front, so to speak, in areas that had not yet been affected. There's been more than $49 million that the Fish and Wildlife Service has distributed for white nose syndrome research and support since 2008. And we continue to get an annual appropriation of about $5 million to do that work. There has been an incredible uptick in the amount of population monitoring work that we have done. Bats are notoriously difficult to track and capture and monitor. It's really difficult to figure out where they're hanging out and where they're spending their time, both because it can be hard to capture them on the landscape and it can also be very hard to track them. That was the body of my work when I was getting my master's here. You're putting little tiny transmitters on a bat that can go in any direction and travel pretty quickly, and you're trying to stay on the ground with vehicles with antennas that can pick up their signal and literally chase them across the landscape to figure out where they're foraging at night and where they're hunkering down to roost overnight. So you can't always keep up with them, and quite often you lose them even when you're trying to track them. And so the North American Bat Monitoring Program was established and born out of the recognition that we couldn't even track the declines due to white nose syndrome because we didn't have enough information to know what bat populations had been before it arrived. And so the North American Bat Monitoring Program was established and launched in 2015. And since 2015, they have amassed more than 68 million records that have been consolidated from research prior to white nose syndrome, during the arrival of white nose syndrome, and post white nose syndrome monitoring, so that we could understand what those declines looked like and what they really had been. And that effort continues. And also there's a citizen involvement component to that too. So a lot of community scientist work where people can volunteer to go out and track bats and participate in that. It's very cool. The partnership work is phenomenal. Bat biologists are more connected than almost any other species that I have ever worked with, in terms of being able to reach out to your counterparts in Montana or Florida or Arizona and ask what they're seeing and what's going on. There's an incredible amount of work at the federal level, the state government level, the academic level, NGOs, volunteer groups. They're all very connected to share information and find appropriate locations to test treatments and novel ways of combating the fungus, which has grown out of this. So that work continues. There's been a quite beautiful uptick in public awareness and education around bats and their needs and their fascinating life histories. So I have seen in the 15 years or so that I've been working with bats, a real shift in public sentiment towards bats. Now it's much more strongly like, oh, those really, those poor creatures, how are they doing? People are concerned for them in a way that I don't think was the case before white nose syndrome. And that continues. Bat Week is coming up October 24th through the 31st of this year is Bat Week. And then there's been a lot of decontamination and containment work. So awareness on how people can pick up the fungus and inadvertently move it across the country. So a lot of, if you ever visit Mammoth Springs or Carlsbad Caverns or any of the big commercial caves, they have been really helpful partners in establishing decontamination protocols to make sure that people aren't picking up the fungus, then going home, visiting another cave and moving the fungus to a place where it would not have gotten on its own. And it's exciting to say that we are finally at a point where we are testing treatments and trying to aid recovery of bat species. And so this is work that I still get to be peripherally involved in. That picture at the bottom is researchers in Hibernia Cave. This was in July of 2022. They are testing UV light treatment. So in the same way that you would use UV light to decontaminate hospital rooms where you can kill fungus and kill bacterial things with high doses of UV light, they are testing using that very same technology in the mines and caves where bats are hibernating to see if they can kill the fungus and therefore reduce the exposure of bats to these cave environments and hopefully therefore elevate their ability to be resilient in the face of smaller doses of the fungus. And then the picture at top right is an experimental vaccine that is being applied to bats out west. This is actually a rabies pox virus that helps to elevate the bat's immune system. And it does so in a way that doesn't actually help them fight white nose syndrome, but it helps prime their immune system so they're more resilient to the exposure of the fungus. And so that work is being tested in a number of states with a number of species, typically either in summer maternity colonies where they are gathering together and they can safely administer that vaccine while bats are still active, or in very like what they call fall swarms, so pre-hibernation where bats are starting to congregate at the mines and caves, but they're not actually hibernating yet. And they want to give the bat that vaccine treatment when it's active to prime the immune system before they shut down for hibernation. So that work happens during the active season. And there's been some really, really promising results on that work so far that show that it can be most effective either immediately before white nose arrives in an area or when those bats are sort of undergoing their first wave of exposure to the fungus and to the disease. And so we're very hopeful that that may be another tool in the toolbox to help aid recovery of these species. One thing that people often ask is, what can I do to help bats in my area? And bat boxes are very often a go-to for that. And they can be wonderful. They can be very excellent for all sorts of reasons, but it is important to know what they won't do. So they may bring bats close to you for your benefit and your enjoyment. They may provide an opportunity to teach about bats and build appreciation for bats. But because they do not provide winter habitat that can be treated, they are not likely to halt or reverse the decline of bat populations due to white nose syndrome. There are a number of different kinds of setups. There are houses, there are condos, there are kits, there are plans. And it's important to know that every different bat species uses these differently. So it's really important to know what bat species you have in your area and to build a box and choose your box appropriately. One box is not the same for all species or all places. There's really no good way to attract them to the box per se. So they kind of have to discover it on their own and choose to be there. There's no way to sort of put out an ad and recruit them to your bat box. So people sometimes get disappointed that they've put up a box and years go by and they don't see bats using it. Doesn't mean they never will, just means they haven't chosen it yet. And then there's the question of where to place them. And so the old thought is that you want to place them 10 to 12 feet up away from disturbance of activity on the ground, facing to the south or the southeast, so they get good solar exposure and early prolonged sun. But you don't want to only have them in those spots, because if you have a really hot spell, the box can get too hot for the bats, and you don't want to have them in a box that can cause them to get so hot that they die from, heat stroke, essentially. So it can also be important to place one in the shade so that when you have heat spells, your bats have a choice of which microenvironment they might like to be in. It's also important to keep them away from predator perches, because you don't want snakes or raccoons going in after the bats that you've finally gotten in your bat box. Other ways that you can help support bat conservation is the same stuff that I'm sure many of you are also thinking about and doing on your own, is helping to support habitat conservation in general. Turning off unnecessary lights can be helpful. Interestingly enough, the flip side of that is some of the research is currently turning on artificial lights outside caves and mines to draw insects in and help fatten bats immediately before hibernation to help them get through white nose. So there's flip sides of that argument depending on what you're trying to do. You can also promote natural habitat around your home. A lot of the insects that bats eat will be drawn to natural pollinator gardens and, grasses and fields. And so that natural habitat can help support the bats as well. And minimizing the use of pesticides can also be really helpful. As I mentioned before, you certainly don't want to handle bats, but you also really don't want to disturb them. When they are resting, it's important that they be able to conserve their body energy, either for migration or for getting ready for hibernation. There are times, as much as we love bats, that they get themselves into places where we don't desire to have them. And so there are ways and times of year to really remove them effectively and humanely. And that's really important. If you know someone who's trying to get rid of bats in their home or in their barn or in their structures, make sure that they're working with a reputable company to do that. You don't want to exclude bats during the time of year when they have dependent young, for example. So it's really important that those exclosures happen after the young are volant and can fly on their own, so that you're not locking the mothers away from dependent young in a particular structure, for example. And you can also be an ambassador and spread the word of how fascinating these creatures really are. So I think that's all I had planned for you. I did anticipate there may be some questions, but yes.
But I remember as a kid in the early 70s, go out in the backyard at night, and adults thought they saw a bat flying around and said, "Quick, get inside, they're gonna get in your hair." Now, any legitimacy in their fear for bats that carry rabies, but if they're using sonar, why would they be interested in what there was above in your ear?
Yeah, so let me repeat the question, then I'll answer it for you. So for the online audience, the question was, I remember being a kid in the backyard and running around and bats swooping and parents or elders warning me to get in the house because they carry rabies and they'll get stuck in your hair. And is that a thing? Do they really do that? If they echolocate, why is it that that's going to happen? It's a misnomer. They can detect, when they're echolocating, they can detect something as thin as a single strand of human hair. So they know you are there. They're not accidentally running into you. But very frequently, because of our body chemistry, anybody who's been out before and swatted insects around from their face knows that insects tend to be attracted to us. And so what is most likely happening is that we are out and about, we have insects gathering around us, and the bats are detecting that and going after their food is what is most likely happening there. Sick bats act like sick bats. They would not be sort of flying around doing their thing typically. And so very often if you find a bat on the ground or sort of shivering or acting oddly, those are the bats to be concerned about. In most cases, they will not get stuck in your hair. Any other questions? Yes.
If there is a bat in your home or something, and maybe like a local animal control isn't as helpful as you'd like them to be, what might be the best way that you can remove the bat yourself?
Sure. Okay. So the question was, if there is a bat in your home and animal control is perhaps not as helpful as you would like, what can you do about it? I will always say I am not a doctor, and rabies is something you don't want to mess with. And so the primary health concern that they always quote is, were you in a bedroom? Were you sleeping? Was the bat in a bedroom? Is there a chance that something may have happened while you were sleeping that could have gotten you ill? That's the primary concern. So if that's the scenario, what you really want to do is make sure that you safely capture the bat. They will want to test the bat for rabies, which means that they will kill the bat, but then they will be able to give you certainty as to whether you were exposed or not. That said, they typically don't want you handling the bat. So in a case where it's like the bat got into my house, it's the middle of the day, I know I just discovered it, it's a young juvenile bat. All young juvenile animals do stupid things and get themselves in dicey situations. It happens with people too. Usually they got in through a tiny little crevice and couldn't find their way out. And so, you want to always have a towel or something to sort of get the bat and do not allow it to come in contact with you, and then let it out on its merry way. That's generally the best way to do it. But primarily, you want to make sure that you have not been put at risk because you don't want to mess with rabies. Yes.
Why is it that bats seem to be transmitting a lot of really nasty disease throughout the world in the last decade or two?
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, why is it that bats seem to transmit so many deadly diseases around the world? We've heard those cases uptick. I think there was just another Nipah outbreak that I heard about in the last month or so, which is a disease of bats that shows up around cattle and horses and camels in Africa. The reason for that stems from bats' rather incredible ability to fight off viruses. So their immune systems are really, really, really incredible. Bats are very long-lived. 30 years is like within the range of normal, and some bats, we don't know how long they can live. They don't age. So you can't look at a bat, they don't get gray hair, they don't get short in the teeth. If you, even genetically, if you look at their telomeres, which often our telomeres they shorten as we age. You can look at the cellular level and age an animal based on the length of their telomeres. Bats don't show that at all. So they have an incredible immune system. They have secrets that we have not yet unlocked for staying youthful and longevity. And their immune systems are so strong that they can harbor an incredible amount of viruses that are harmful for the rest of us, and they don't affect bats at all. And so the reason that they tend to transmit those viruses is because they're carrying them without any qualms whatsoever. It's not making them sick. And so their immune systems aren't fighting off those viruses, and they aren't killing those viruses. The problem, of course, and this is happening all over the world, is that humans are encroaching more and more on wild habitats. And so we are putting ourselves in closer and closer proximity to wild animals. And when that happens, we're inevitably putting ourselves in situations where we can encounter diseases that we would not have encountered them before. And so in the case of Nipah virus, that is one where these bats roost in areas that are now sort of being used for grazing, and so we have cattle and we have horses in areas where it used to be wild bat habitat, and the cattle and the horses will typically pick up the Nipah virus from the bat droppings. So bats will poop it out. Horses and cattle will encounter it as they feed. The cattle and the horses get sick. And then typically when people pick it up, they're getting sick from the cattle and the horses. They're not directly getting sick from the bats.
Check your chat box.
Oh, no, I didn't check the chat box. Let me get out of this screen. Thanks to the online audience patience while where'd it go? More chat. All right. Chatting as a guest. If anyone viewing home has a question, please chat it. Okay. From Steve, do you think it would be feasible to create artificial hibernaculum caves for bats in northern New Jersey with the objective of controlling the white nose fungus better in a man-made cave? So this is something that we've actually looked into in the early years of white nose. There was, let me see if I can get the name. I think it was Milhegan Basin National Wildlife Refuge in Vermont. I think was an old military, they had old military bunkers on that refuge. And so that was one of the things they looked into early was could they draw the bats into those old military bunkers that were man-made, that didn't have any of the natural microflora, microfauna that you would find in cave systems? Could they be decontaminated at the end of every single season? Would that help bats survive if you could do that there? That was not determined to be all that effective, but it is a tool in the box that we're looking at. I think in Long Island, they're doing some of that work too, where they're actually installing underground concrete bunkers, that they can do the same thing. There's like a ladder into the bunker that you can go in and decontaminate it every single year and come back. You know, the bats can then have a clean environment every winter as they enter hibernation. So they are looking into some of that work. The question gets at that distinction between natural cave environments where you have very sensitive cave species, cave fauna, cave bacteria, cave fungus. You don't want to kill a fungus in a natural cave environment that's also going to wipe out the natural cave flora and fauna. And so a lot of these treatments are really only useful in those man-made environments where you don't have that natural flora and fauna to be concerned about. So that is something that they are looking. It's one of the tools in the box. The trick there is you can't always train the bats to use the artificial hibernaculum, so that becomes the problem. The next question was, are the radio frequency trackers you use unique to each bat or just generic to the project? So the answer on that is that we would use a specific radio frequency for each bat that we tracked. And you would have the number of bats you could track at a given time was limited by the number of people you had. So when I had 6 interns working with me for my research, we would only track 3 bats at a time because they move around a whole lot. And it takes an awful lot of effort to track them. So we didn't want to put more trackers on bats than we could keep up with. So we would choose unique radio frequencies for each of those 3 bats. And then when those 3 bats, if we got lucky, they would wear those transmitters for 3 weeks. If we were unlucky, they would shed them after 24 hours. So we could sort of rotate those frequencies based on who we had out there and make sure that we were only honing in on a specific bat. And that's how we knew where that bat was going. And we weren't chasing the same bat to 2 or 3 different locations. We're getting them confused. One new message. Let's see. I can't scroll. Why am I not scrolling? Maybe somebody else can see that. Oh, here we go. Oh, that was the thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Corinne. Yeah, Corinne has read that bats don't fly up, they drop down. That is true. So as you're handling bats, releasing bats, working with bats, and you go to let them go, you often hold your hand up and they drop off the surface. They let the wind catch underneath them as they extend there, and then they can swoop up. But they will climb. They're very good climbers. As we learned, they're related to primates. They came from tree climbing critters. So they will climb up in elevation to get to a spot where they have the ability to drop down. And there are a few species that can sort of do a minimal jump So they might be able, they don't run and jump, but they can sort of spring up enough to get enough space under the wings to maybe do one flap, and then they can lift up. But there was a PBS bat special that I watched last year that talked about Brazilian free-tailed bats. So these are the bats of Austin, Texas, and the Congress Avenue Bridge that are so famous, like the millions and millions of bats that live there. But when they roost in caves, there are snakes that hang out all along the cave entrance, just waiting for one of those young bats to make a mistake and fly into another bat. If they hit the ground, they may be toast. So they make quite a tasty snack for a lot of snakes that will hang out along those cave entrances, because the bats are coming out in such huge numbers. If they fly into each other in these mega swarms of bats and fall out, they make a nice little morsel for a snake. And if they were able to jump up much more quickly, it wouldn't be such an issue. But if they can't get up and into flight again, then they're easy pickings. Yes.
And the migratory bats that live in New Jersey, how far do they go?
They'll go down into the Carolinas and in Virginia. They do go into torpor. So they will look for leaf litter on the forest floor. So if you have, as we often know, if you have mulch in your backyard or whatever, that contains like a blanket in the winter, so they can burrow into the leaf litter in the forest floor. That provides some warmth, and they'll come out. If you have a nice mild day, 40-degree temperatures, they'll come out, because in the South, you may still have insects that are active in the wintertime. So they can sort of get through the winter with that level of insect activity. They won't go into a true hibernation, but they will drop their body temperature and go into a torpor so that they're conserving energy. One of the interesting things that we have found that we did not know before is that along coastal New England, we think that our hibernating bats, our northern long-eared bats in particular, are an example of this, may be acting like migratory bats. So they may hang out in these, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, Long Island, New England coastal areas, because they tend to have milder winters, and you may have some insect activity in the wintertime. So they will sort of do the same thing. And we're finding a lot of bats hibernating in basements in Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. Excuse me, that we didn't know about before, because they have the ability to be active in the wintertime. Really cool.
Question from like the birding world is, with your experience, can you identify bats just by the shape and by the wing cadence that's different by species?
Oh, I wish it were as easy as it is for birds. Not quite. The question was, can you decipher a bat by its wing cadence or its shape in the sky the way you can with some birds? I will say some people, Chris Corbin is the gentleman, he's from Australia, who invented the Anabat system of recording bat calls. He's actually blind, so he relies very strongly on his hearing. He can actually hear bats, and he can hear some of the bats that the rest of us can't, and can tell from one flying by, oh, that was a this, that was a that, that was a that. Most of us can't do that. His hearing is particularly attuned to things because of his blindness. Some people can hear hoary bats because their calls are so low frequency that they are actually within the range of human hearing for some people who can hear really high frequencies. So some people can actually hear hoary bats. That may be one that you can detect. Other than that, I think I can tell a big brown bat flying around in my yard because of their body size. They're bigger than the myotis, but you can't confirm that you're right unless you catch them in hand, which you can't do. So I may be just very confident in myself, but I could be entirely wrong. And when they're flying around at night, it's so hard to see them that behaviorally you don't have the same clues that you would have for birds. So it's not very easy to see a bird flying around above the tree canopy at midnight, or else I would wager a bet that that was probably a hoary bat, or it's probably a red bat, but it's just harder to see because it's night.
But you can't, like, there's a migration pattern to pick up on a certain.
No, they don't really have wing beats the way you have certain flutter patterns. Woodpeckers will do the flap, 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 dip, flap, 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 dip. Summer soarers, your hawks will flap, your turkey vultures
Is there a
will.
particular time that you'd be looking for a migratory bat or not?
Not really. No, it's more seasonally dependent more than time of day. Yeah. Yes, Corinne. Are they sexually dimorphic? That's a good question. Some of them are. The red bats and the hoary bats in particular, that like right around the shoulders, the red bat males have these like really brilliantly silver fur patterns that the females don't have. They're really very pretty, but the males and females in terms of their fur coloration are not. In terms of their physical morphology, they're sexually dimorphic, but not in the fur patterns. And there's not really a size distinction between males and females. And you had a question.
Wind power plants, how much of the that, especially comparison to birds?
Especially comparison to birds was the question. How much have wind turbines affected bats? We find an awful lot of red bats and hoary bats in the migratory species under the wind turbines. It is really hard to quantify what percentage of the population gets hit or how many individuals are getting hit. And I'm not confident that I'm remembering this number right, but it's hundreds of thousands of bats in a given year that are getting hit by these turbines. And like I said before, it could be because they're investigating the turbines, right? They are attracted to them. But I had heard one researcher with concern that we may be facing a loss of 50% of our red bats over the next 20 years due to wind build out. So it's a significant concern. And red bats our migratory tree bats are not impacted by white nose. So if white nose is hammering our hibernating bats, and we're relying more on the migratory tree bats that are not affected, then they're getting hit by wind. So it is a concern, but it's also one that we feel hopeful we can sort of figure out with more of that deterrent research. There's also, it's well known that by, what's the term? My NA bat friends would have this term in a second, but there's when you feather the blades, basically when you pivot them so that they're not turning at low wind speeds, it's a cut-in speed is basically what it is. So there are very, very low wind speeds where you're really not generating power, but those blades are sort of passively spinning with low wind speeds. That's when we get a majority of our bat mortality, was when those blades are really moving pretty slowly. And also during bat migration. So there's a seasonality to it. So if the wind companies set that cut-in speed higher, in other words, the blades don't start turning at wind speeds of 5 miles per hour, but they do start turning at wind speeds of 15 miles per hour, bats are less active at higher wind speeds because it's physically more difficult for them to be out and about on the landscape when the wind is blowing faster. So if you can elevate that cut-in speed and the blades only start turning at 15 miles an hour, you actually miss that low wind speed situation where most of the bats are active, and you can drastically reduce your bat mortality by setting those cut-in speeds higher. The only concern with that at this point is that that is a voluntary measure. So wind companies are not required to set their cut-in speeds higher. If they don't know about it, or if it's not a concern, or if they're not connected with it, or if it's not, it does have some economic impact. But relative to what they're generating off of high wind speeds, it can be more or less minimal in some places. Oh, good. How large is the flight territory of a bat? If they migrate, do they return to the same area? So yes, they can be very, 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 they call it high fidelity, very site faithful, year to year to year to year. And so that's where banding a bat and tracking a bat can be useful, because you can see a bat coming back repeatedly. What is their site territory? So what is the name of the golf course? King George Road. There's a golf course down King George Road, sort of towards the, maybe Warrenbrook. Yeah, that sounds familiar. So where was this adventurous epic chase that we had? I'm trying to remember. Might have been, I don't remember which of my 3 maternity colonies this bat was. It might have been down by pool 3A and 3B. So let's say Great Brook. I'm not confident that I'm remembering that with 100% accuracy, but the bat was captured along, back behind pool 3A and 3B. This is an Indiana bat from my master's work. And 3 nights in a row, we kept finding it moving south and we just couldn't catch it and we would lose it. And who knows where it went. But the next day it would be back roosting in about the same area near pool 3A and 3B where the Passaic River and the Great Brook meet. And so finally, after the 3rd day, we got better leapfrogging each other to chase it. And it was peeling off and heading down to that golf course off of King George Road. And over the span, that's a 9-mile trek. And it was getting there in like 30 minutes. They can move. And Brazilian free-tailed bat, I didn't know this until I watched this documentary last year, so I'm still learning things, but Brazilian free-tailed bats can do horizontal flight speeds of more than 100 miles an hour. 100 horizontal flight speed. I'm not talking like a peregrine falcon diving. I'm talking like 100 miles an hour horizontal. It's mind-boggling. So if you could do 100 miles an hour, I mean, how big could your territory be? Dusk comes, like a 30-minute commute, no big deal. Yeah, so they can have quite extensive ranges and they're opportunistic, right? They will, here they followed, my Indiana bats followed our stream corridors, nice protected forest cover above, so you're not getting picked off by owls. You can scoot under the trees, follow the stream corridor. We have streams all across the swamp. They could easily pick up and move. So several kilometers, easy. We were, from one roost to the next day, they can move. Yeah.
You mentioned bats being picked off by owls. How sensitive are they to like the call of a great horned owl? Will they clear out of the area once it gets itself known?
So the question was, how sensitive are bats to the call of an owl? Will they respond to it and clear out? Yeah, I don't know how to answer that because what it would require to answer is more of an experimental setup. And that's not work that I did. There's probably a paper out there somewhere on it. But what I will say is we would always record the phase of the moon as a part of our data sheet. What's the temperature? What's the wind? What's the humidity? What's the moon phase? Because on these nights when you have a full moon and clear skies, and we've all been out on those evenings where you don't need a headlight, you don't need a headlamp. It's just like having nightlight on in your house. It's so bright. We did find that bat activity would be a little bit reduced after the moon came up on those nights. We assume because they were more easily seen in the night sky. So I suspect that they are somewhat responsive to it, but driven by their other physiological needs, right? If they have dependent young and they have a pup back in the roost that needs to eat, because their metabolism is burning so hot, they probably can't afford not to eat. So they might come out before the moon rises or, after the moon sets. The moonrise time is different every night. So the moon may not be up until midnight. They could have 3 hours of foraging. So I think they do respond to it, but they're still very strongly driven by what their physiology demands. Yeah. Do they mate for life and how many offspring do they have? We don't know. No, I don't think they mate for life. Bats are very slow to reproduce. Typically, this is why we're so concerned about the white-nosed losses, because it will take them so long to rebuild their populations. Most Myotis bats will have 1 pup per year. Red bats are different. Red bats can have 5 pups a year, which is like mind-blowing when you're carrying these things around with you, right? Moving from tree to tree. a little bit about bat physiology with regard to reproduction. They mate in the fall. They have delayed implantation. So they store sperm all through the winter months, whether they're migrating or hibernating. And we don't know what it is that triggers implantation in the spring. It's probably triggered by body fat and body physiology and hormones and all that stuff. They don't get pregnant until April, having mated in August or September. And then if there is a significant stressor, they will resorb the fetus and not carry it to term as well. So one of the things that we're concerned about is reduced reproductivity in the face of white nose syndrome as a stressor. And we are seeing in some of the cases where we're doing in mines where we're doing a lot of winter research, we are seeing higher portions of males in our captures and fewer females. So it may be that female survival is reduced. The species as a whole may be recovering, but female survival may be declining. We're seeing a lot more males in our captures, and that sex ratio is not even. So they're so cool. They do so many cool things. I could geek out on them all day long. But
Quick question on the wind turbines. Does it matter if there's wind turbines now 40 miles off the shore? Do they migrate over water?
do they migrate over water, and is there a concern with offshore winds? Yes and yes. We absolutely have been hearing reports for years and years and years of migratory bats coming to rest on ships in the middle of the ocean. So we do know that our migratory bats are absolutely migrating offshore. We are learning more about what that looks like and how far offshore they're hanging out. It's difficult, as you can imagine, to survey an area under a wind turbine on land to see how many bats are getting hit. It is significantly more difficult to do that surveillance in the ocean. So they're trying to figure out all sorts of technological tools that can be used to monitor both bat mortality under these offshore wind turbines and also bat activity. And so there is, oh gosh, what is the name of the tower? There are nano tags that are being used, and there are, is it Modus towers? Yeah. Yes. Okay. So these are a network of telemetry towers that have been used. Initially, they were used for bird research to track migratory birds. And so you put a transmitter on a bird, and as that bird flies down the coast, the towers are set to listen for these pre-programmed frequencies. So as the bird passes the tower in New England, gets a ping on the New England tower. As the bird later passes a tower in Long Island, gets a ping on the Long Island tower. As it then heads over the Chesapeake Bay, gets a ping on the Chesapeake Bay tower. So you can actually track bats offshore with these series of towers, and they are looking for ways to install these Modus towers offshore in the offshore environment and use that technology with bats as well as with birds to start to get a sense of what that offshore activity looks like seasonally. What does it look like? Migration patterns, what does it look like during the active season when it's just summer and they're foraging? What does it look like, and how far offshore are these bats hanging out? We're still learning. But the short answer is that absolutely offshore is still a concern for bats. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes. Oh, how do they catch the insect? That's such a great question. So bats' legs are, sorry, online audience, you can't see this. I'm doing a little dance. Bats' legs are as fold backwards, right? There's fold forwards. So the knee is actually articulated to fold this way. And so the flight pattern that you were asking about earlier, can you tell different bat species apart? No. Can you tell a bird from a bat? Yes. The reason you can tell a bat flight pattern is because you'll see them sort of flutter, drop. What they're doing when they drop is scooping up the insect either with their wings or folding their tail membranes up and catching it in the tail membrane, if not catching it with their feet. And then the drop is them getting the insect into their mouth and then going on their merry way. So, and that's the same thing that those fish-eating bats will do as they're swooping over a stream, is they're scooping up the fish with their feet. So how that happened in evolution, where those tree climbing primates sort of like literally wrote, I don't know, it would be fascinating to do that study, whether their pelvis literally rotated it's like their legs had to rotate 180 degrees in their body to make that happen. But it's very frequently that they're scooping them up with their wings or their tails. Really cool. Very, very, very cool to watch in slow motion on that camera.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank Marilyn.
Happy to do it.